Hey everyone. So I've got a new recording setup and I'm very excited to resume my Meshuggah Note Choice video series. So the original goal of doing these Note Choice videos was to eventually get to discussing Meshuggah guitar solos. And so I thought it would make sense to look at the riffs first and then eventually the guitar solos. But there's something kind of in the middle where you have these contrasting lead parts that repeat alongside the riffs. So they're not quite guitar solos. And I think a good name for them is layers. And I think these are actually super interesting. There's some really interesting development across the years as Meshuggah explore new ideas. And I think out of these lessons, examining the layers probably has the most general compositional benefit. So like, even if you don't want to play music that sounds like Meshuggah, looking at how they make their compositions work using layers, I think that those lessons apply to way more music in general than some of the other lessons in this series. So I'm going to put up some timestamps for the various sections of the video, because there's a few things I want to discuss, and some of them are maybe more for Meshuggah nerds, and some of them are maybe more general. So I'll try and start with the more general stuff and then get nerdier and nerdier as we go. So I think the two most important things you could take away from this coming video lesson is using contrast effectively and using simplicity effectively. So contrast is important because when you're adding something new to a piece of music, it has to be different enough to add something, right? Adding more of the same does not make anything change, but it also got to be similar enough so it gels with what was there already. And Meshuggah are absolute masters of this. And I'd like to point out as well that using contrast effectively is important in more than just music. So I like to think of, for example, in the film Alien, when they're exploring the derelict, there's all this classic H.R. Geiger biomechanical stuff going on. But there's also this really clear, piercing blue laser going through smoke. And the contrast between these two elements is more than the sum of its parts, right? And I think this is a really good visual metaphor for that classic Meshuggah sound, where you have these kind of like complex, grinding guitar parts, and then also these like siren notes cutting through it with simplicity. So the first thing I investigated when I was looking at these Meshuggah layers was the note choice. And generally speaking, it's the same techniques as we've discussed for the riff writing. So it is diminished in chromatic scales, the same way as the riffs were. There are some things that are different though. So for example, in terms of the register, so how high-pitched or low-pitched the notes are, the riffs are generally low-pitched and the layers are generally higher-pitched, right? Contrast. Layers have to stand out to add something, right? If you just added another low-pitched, complicated guitar part, it would be very messy and indistinct. In terms of the melodic shape, generally speaking, the layers have relatively small melodic jumps. So Meshuggah riffs, although some of them are kind of narrow and chromatic, they often contain large leaps. Whereas the layer parts, generally speaking, are simpler and contain more stepwise motion. In terms of the rhythms used, generally speaking, Meshuggah riffs are really complicated. Meshuggah layers, on the other hand, are super simple. And I mean, like, maybe they play a whole note, or maybe they play a note that sustains over 2 whole bars. They're almost always in 4/4, so they're incredibly simple. And I mean, like, a brand new beginner to any instrument would be comfortable with those rhythms. So I think that's a real important compositional takeaway. Meshuggah, who certainly can write complicated rhythmic stuff, often find the most effective layers are incredibly simple rhythmically. In terms of the harmony, so generally speaking, Meshuggah doesn't have much harmony going on. There's not too many chords changing. It's often single notes or power chords or double power chords. In terms of the articulation, generally Meshuggah riffs have lots of short, sharp notes. Maybe they're palm muted, and whenever there are string bends, they tend to be exaggerated somehow. In contrast, whenever Meshuggah do layers, they tend to be very legato. They tend to be smooth. They use tremolo picking to sustain notes for a very long time. They tend to use a few slides, and when they use bends, they tend to be subtler. So overall, across all of those dimensions, Meshuggah are generally contrasting, but there's a few things that tend to sync up, right? So the note choice is pretty similar in both, so that obviously matches rather than clashes, which makes sense. And then in terms of the rhythm, it's really simple, and that's really important in helping it slot in compositionally, and we'll get to that in a sec. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that by using really rhythmically simple layers that also use very simple note choice, basically the same kind of concepts as the riffs, you can end up with some really strong compositional options. So I'm going to lay out two of those. The first thing is that whenever your layers are really simple and use the same note choice as your riffs, they probably go with more than one of your riffs. So this is a compositional thing that they build up a lot, especially during Chaosphere. So you might have an intro riff with a layer, and then in the outro, the same layer, but paired with a different riff. So I want you to think about that in terms of how it makes the whole song work. So it stops it sounding like a collection of cool riffs. So that's a problem a lot of gent artists have, is they're very good at writing a cool riff and then another cool riff and then another cool riff. But the songs end up feeling disjointed. By having something that remains consistent, you can really tie the piece together. And the only way you're going to get something that fits with two different complicated riffs is to make it simple and minimal. And this is something Meshuggah use a lot. And it's often something that really, for me, ties together a song. So I'm going to go through some examples with that. And I'd like to point out this is something they've used throughout their entire career. So that's a really strong endorsement of it as a composition technique. So there's another cool thing that's enabled by using such simple layers, and I kind of want to explain it through a couple of related examples first. So generally speaking, music is filled with tension and release. So for example, you might have a lot of short, sharp, complicated rhythms. They're followed by big, open notes and simpler rhythms. And that can be really satisfying. Long before another thing you might have is you might have some kind of complex rhythmic part on the guitars, doubled by the drums, and then the drums change to make playing the underlying 4/4. And that's a dramatic simplification that can also sound really good. So you can actually do a similar thing with your layers. So if you've written a really complicated rhythmic part, if you have something really simple over the top of it that tracks to the 4/4, then you similarly make the 4/4 more obvious to your listeners and tie the whole riff together. So by adding something to your complex music, you've actually made it much more understandable, much more intuitively groovy. And I think this is really powerful. So hopefully I've briefly convinced you of the value of looking at contrast and really emphasizing simplicity. So contrast, think about the different ways that you can make your parts mesh with or contrast to the rest of the track. And then with simplicity, don't be afraid to write incredibly simple parts and use them to tie together your composition. They're often the glue that makes things sound cohesive. You don't have to necessarily write really exciting layers to go with your really exciting riffs. It might just be too much. Consider scaling back the layers in complexity so that you can let the rest of the track shine. So having said that, those are the two major themes. For those of you that want a little bit more detail and want to explore how Meshuggah actually developed on these ideas throughout their whole career, I actually have gone through every Meshuggah album and every Meshuggah song to date and looked at their use of layers. So the next section is going to be slightly more detailed. I'm going to look at each Meshuggah album and how their use of layers evolved. And I'm going to occasionally throw up some tabs, which is why I have this screen real estate over here. And I'm going to try and link to them in the description in the order that I use them. I will say that almost all of these are simple enough that you really could work them out by ear or write them yourselves. So hopefully there's going to be some serious Meshuggah nerds now joining me for the rest of the video. So this is my spreadsheet of all the layers I considered for making this video. And I'll link it in the description so people can easily click through and hear the things I talk about. And also because I'm not going to discuss every single layer, but just the important themes. So I do think there's something you can take away just from the fact that as Meshuggah progressed in their career and grew as musicians, they tended to use more layers rather than fewer. And so I think that's a good rubber stamp that this was something they thought was consistently cool and decided to keep. And another thing that's interesting about the layers in Destroy, Erase, Improve is even though it's the first couple of layers, there's already the two main kinds that we're going to see throughout this. So there's simple melodies played in octaves, usually around a diminished scale. And then there's also some kind of dissonance spam. So in this case, Future Breed Machine. The intro is a simple minor second interval played in quarter notes, so dissonance, but extremely rhythmically simple. And then Suffer in Truth has some simple diminished octave melodies. So both really simple, but those are ideas that we're going to see in every album. So it's really worth paying attention to them here in this really early form. So in Chaosphere, we start to hear more development of both of these ideas. So that's using dissonance and using octave melodies. The first thing is, this is the first album where Meshuggah start really consistently using a layer to tie together a song. So in New Millennium Cyanide Christ, in Corridor of Chameleons, and Insane, in all of those tracks, they use the same layer to tie together two separate riffs in the same song. There's also two other techniques I'd like to point out, one of which I'm calling the lick and the other one of which I'm calling the solo segue. So I kind of discussed that this video series is looking at riffs, then layers, then solos. And one of the things Meshuggah tend to do is they tend to use a layer as a bridge between having, say, heavy riffs into a riff and a layer, and then that layer becomes the guitar solo. So that kind of smooths the transition out, and it's something they actually do a lot. So this is the first example of it, and we'll revisit a few more as they come to it. then the lick. So basically, a lot of music is diatonic, which basically means it uses the same pattern as the white notes of a keyboard. So it's C major, A minor, or any of those modes. And then what's interesting is there's a thing Meshuggah tend to use, which is the minimal set of notes you need to prove that you're not in a diatonic context. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you take the major scale or any of the modes attached to that, they follow this pattern. And then that repeats from there. So it's whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. So here's something interesting. Any distance of 2 notes is represented somewhere in there. So if you have a distance of, say, 1 fret, right? Well, that's the distance here. So when you hear these 2 notes together, you could be hearing part of a major scale, right? Or a minor scale, or one of the familiar modes. If you have a distance of, say, 9 semitones, right? That's a distance you can have between 2 notes inside this scale, right? So between the 1st and 6th note. But you can have 3 notes that don't fit together anywhere in that scale. If you have these 3 notes, this pattern with 3 semitones and then 1, that never fits into this pattern. No matter where you put it, there's always 1 note of those 3 that won't fit. So by playing these 3 notes, right, they're the smallest set of notes you can get that definitively state you're not in familiar diatonic territory. So that may be a bit too music nerdy for you, but for me, that's pretty cool, right? And Meshuggah do tend to use those 3 notes, and it is a big part of their sound. It says, hey, we're either in the diminished scale or harmonic minor, but you know what? You're not somewhere safe and familiar. So with nothing, it's still going to be basically octaves, dissonance, and diminished scale melodies. But they start to develop these ideas and find more interesting avenues. So, for example, while there still exists some of the classic kind of smooth octave sound, they also start to use this kind of interesting bendy articulation on their octaves. And they're still also doing that thing where they tie together songs using these simple layers. So another thing that's cool is, for the first time, we start to hear layers that are in odd time signatures. So up to now, all the layers have been super, super simple in stating the 4/4 of the underlying hypermeter, which is a cool sentence. But now we start to hear layers that actually are themselves kind of a little bit more rhythmically interesting. And I don't mean extreme, but certainly odd time signatures. Finally, in terms of contrast, earlier in the video I described how generally Meshuggah riffs are composed of short muted notes, and then the layers are composed of long open notes. But in this case, there's actually a track which, for the first time, we've got a short, sharp layer combined with a more open sounding riff, which I thought was kind of interesting. So Catch 33 is arguably one of the most complex things Meshuggah have done. And in keeping with my theme of contrast, the layers actually got a lot simpler. So in this album, almost all the layers are just tremolo picked notes, right? And they change at 4/4 intervals, very slowly, very simply, right? Now, there are still a few other interesting musical devices, so I'd like to highlight a couple here. So let's say you're in some simple context, so let's say C. We don't know if it's major or minor, but C. Okay, so that's enclosure. You have some target note, generally a consonant one, so in this case, our root note of C, where we want to go to, and what we do is we enclose it. We play the note above it, the note below it, and then the note. This is a really simple technique for building tension and resolution, really structurally sound, and it's all over Catch 33. So something that this series has emphasized again and again is that Meshuggah love tritones. So it's no surprise then, at various pivotal points in this album, the layers move by a tritone. So the most common move is you have a simple E to F layer, and it changes to a B flat B layer. Maybe the notes are in the opposite order, but the basic idea is you have a really simple layer. At clear moments, you transpose it by a tritone. Very straightforward, but classic Meshuggah. So one of the things I've been emphasizing is that the layers are usually simple. What happens if you do have a complex layer? So that actually happens in dehumanization. So one thing I'd like to point out is because the layer is complicated and the riff is complicated, they don't contrast as much. So what they do is they make the layer and the riff match in rhythm. So for example, if you listen to this layer part, that's quite complicated, but it matches the rhythm of the riff. So you can see that syncs up, and that makes it much easier to follow. It's also, I think, actually the first time that Meshuggah write a layer that explicitly matches the rhythm of the riff. And it actually goes with both of these riffs, so... right? So it ties two riffs together in a cool way. Yeah, I just think that's really cool. So Obzen is really cool in that it takes all the ideas from all the previous albums and incorporates them. So we see some octaves, we see diminished scale melodies, we see tremolo pick stuff like Catch 33, we see some dissonance stuff, but something new starts happening in Obzen where the layers start to have multiple voices. So let me show you what I mean and give you some examples of that. So when I say two voices or three voices, I don't literally mean two or three singers. I mean different melodic parts separated by register. So, for example, the most famous guitar part that has two voices has one voice descending chromatically and one voice that rises up the minor scale. Right? That's Stairway to Heaven. I hope that was recognizable. So, Meshuggah used that kind of technique now as well. So it makes sense, right? After years of writing cool single melodies, now they're feeling confident enough to write two melodic parts for their layers. So this part from Bleed, it is a lot simpler than the Stairway to Heaven, but it's still basically two separate voices, one higher, one lower, both with their own little diminished melody. Right, again, simplicity though, right? Very important. Lethargica has a pretty similar section, also with multiple voices, and this is important because they're going to use more of it. It's something that really sticks with them. So Koloss, in the same way as Obzen, takes a lot of the previous techniques and just slightly develops on them. So nothing huge and new happens, but lots of things are slightly improved. So there's a slight increased emphasis on articulation. So there's more prominent use of slides. There's also something exciting in the use of tapping to create a two-voice layer where the tap note produces one single high note as a pedal point, and then there's some other melody underneath. And this is a cool way you can get one guitar player to produce essentially two layers. Another thing that happens is there's some more use of effects to really drive sounds in a more interesting way. And this use of effects then gets developed more in the next album. So the Violent Sleep of Reason really develops on those things that were kind of new in Koloss. So the tapping and the use of effects. So the tapping becomes a lot more developed, and there's a few more examples of it. And there's some really cool use of tapping plus effects to create a whole new texture. So there's a few times in the Violent Sleep of Reason where one guitar uses a combination of delay and harmonizer and tapping to create this kind of cloud of notes. So if you think about it, before we used to have a riff and then a layer. And then we developed this idea of a riff and then a layer that was composed of two lines. Right, so the two voice stuff from Obzen. And now we have this cool new texture, right, that is a riff and then this cloud of notes, which is kind of cool. And it's not an easy sound to create on one guitar. So I think Meshuggah have done a really good job of evolving in this way. One thing to emphasize as well is I really like in Into Decay, there's first of all some octaves that are matched directly to the riff rhythm. So that's something that's relatively rare. You see a similar kind of thing in the tapping solo in Nostrum, where the lead is matched to the backing in a way that's not so typical. And then finally, I'd like to point out that Into Decay, which is one of the doomiest, sludgiest tracks Meshuggah have done for a decade, also has these really beautifully clear, clean layers. And I think that contrast is really deliberate, right? I think that's, it's not a surprise that when they get their sludgiest riffs, they get their brightest layers. So I'm a massive Meshuggah nerd, and hopefully you've enjoyed this kind of tour throughout all of their discography. I hope I've managed to make a couple of the kind of simple, important things really clear in this video and provide plenty of evidence that they're useful. And I think also I hope to have kind of like shown you a really cool way in which Meshuggah have evolved and created great music that's not as obvious as the riff writing. Because I think when I started investigating for this video, I thought the layers are straightforward. I already know how they work. And then I was really pleasantly surprised at just how much they've developed through the years in a way I hadn't really appreciated as a fan before looking into it for this video. And I can say that particularly as the later albums and they've got all this triple voice stuff or the harmonizer and the tapping, I really dig how much that area of their composition has changed and moved forward throughout the years. Yeah, so I hope you've enjoyed it as music nerds, and I hope you've enjoyed it as fans. All right, take care.